The asphalt glistens under the shopping mall's fluorescent lights. A woman in a white Range Rover jerks her steering wheel left, blocking a vintage motorcycle from its parking space. The rider's helmet turns slowly toward her. Their eyes meet through the windshield and something shifts. A single word escapes her lips. No. His hand moves to his chest. You don't know what you just did. Thunder rumbles. Then, a photograph slaps against her windshield and her face goes white. The October afternoon felt like it was holding its breath. Susan Hartwell had spent exactly 3 hours at Riverside Shopping Mall, which meant she'd earned herself a small victory. Her feet hurt, but her closet would thank her. New cocktail dresses don't materialize without dedication, and dedication meant parking closer to the entrance than most people deserved. She pushed open the glass doors of Nordstrom, both hands gripping designer bags that cost more than her car payment. The parking lot shimmered in the heat that refused to break, even though leaves were starting to turn orange somewhere in the world that mattered more than this strip mall in New Jersey. Susan's phone buzzed, a text from her husband, Derek. Don't be late, 7 p.m. reservation. She glanced at her watch, 4:47 p.m. The restaurant was 20 minutes away and she needed to shower. This meant parking near the entrance wasn't just a preference, it was mathematics. Her white Range Rover sat exactly where she'd left it, gleaming like an accusation against the more modest vehicles surrounding it. The parking spot next to hers was empty, had been empty when she arrived. Susan had specifically noted this because it meant no one would ding her door, and she'd paid enough for the paint job to have opinions about who was allowed near it. She loaded her bags into the trunk with the careful efficiency of someone who'd optimized every movement, then slid behind the wheel. The engine purred, climate control set to 72 degrees. Radio off, she needed to think about tonight anyway. Derek's boss was coming. The whole thing mattered in the way things matter when you've spent 15 years making sure they matter. The parking lot was moderately full, that frustrating Wednesday afternoon zone where spaces weren't obvious. Susan navigated toward the front exit, which meant cutting through the center row where the spaces were most coveted. She saw it immediately, a spot opening up, right near the entrance, diagonal to the walkway. Someone was leaving a Prius, backing out with the tentative movements of an elderly driver. Susan accelerated gently, already calculating the angle of her approach. She could slip in smoothly, be inside the restaurant by 6:55, shower still possible if Derek didn't take forever getting ready. The Prius cleared the space. Susan turned her wheel, lining up the Range Rover. Then the motorcycle came from nowhere, a beautiful, terrible growl of an engine that made her flinch. Vintage Indian Chief, mint condition, the kind of bike that screamed money in a way that actual money couldn't seem to. It approached from her left, angled directly toward the same spot, moving with the casual certainty of someone who had already claimed it mentally. Susan's foot remained steady on the gas. The bike and the Range Rover arrived at the space in the exact same moment. The rider was a man, mid-40s, she thought, though the full-face helmet obscured everything but the angle of his shoulders. He wore a leather jacket that looked like it had actually been worn, not purchased at a mall to look worn. His gloved hands controlled the bike with an ease that suggested intimacy, not just with the motorcycle, but with competence itself. He stopped. She didn't. The Range Rover's front bumper edged into the space. Susan kept her eyes forward, her expression the particular blend of aggressive ignorance that had served her well in 17 years of New Jersey living. She would not make eye contact. She would not acknowledge the motorcycle. She would simply park her car and exit with the unhurried confidence of someone whose entitlement was written into her actual birth certificate. The bike's engine cut off. Susan pulled into the spot, finding the perfect center point with a gentle adjustment of the wheel. She turned off the ignition. The silence that followed felt like a held breath. Then the helmet turned toward her windshield. She felt his gaze like a physical thing, not aggressive but present, weighty, the kind of attention that doesn't go away when you ignore it. Susan grabbed her purse from the passenger seat. She would not look at him. She was already composing her mental narrative, some biker guy, probably high, definitely not worth acknowledging. She opened the door. "Excuse me." His voice wasn't what she expected. No trace of anger yet. It was something else, a kind of careful precision, like he was pronouncing words in a language he'd recently learned. Susan turned. The biker had removed his helmet, and she found herself looking at a face that contradicted everything her assumptions had built. He was handsome in an architectural sense, all strong lines and intelligent eyes. There was a thin scar running from his left temple to his jaw, pale and old, like a question asked a long time ago. "That was my space," he said, "not aggressive, not yet." Susan allowed a small smile, the kind she deployed when Derek brought home friends who'd had too much wine and needed correcting. "I don't see your name on it," she said. She turned away, beginning the walk toward the mall entrance. Behind her, she heard the bike's kickstand click down. "Actually," he said, and now there was something different in his voice, "you kind of do." Susan didn't turn around. She kept walking, her heels clicking against the asphalt in a rhythm that felt like punctuation. Around her, the parking lot continued its mundane existence, cars coming and going, the distant cry of a child, the steady hum of commerce and entitlement. She made it approximately 12 feet before something made her stop. It wasn't his footsteps. It was the absolute silence that followed, that particular kind of quiet that comes when someone stops expecting you to turn around. Susan turned around. The biker was standing beside her car, not doing anything threatening, just standing there regarding her vehicle the way someone might regard a problem they were solving in their head. His jacket hung open, and she could see a t-shirt underneath, faded and dark with something that might have been a logo. "Is there something?" she asked, her tone suggesting that whatever he was about to say would be both predictable and beneath her. "Yeah," he said, "there's something." He reached into his jacket pocket, and Susan felt her entire nervous system spike. Not fear exactly, but preparation for fear, like her body was completing a sentence her mind hadn't started. He pulled out his phone. "There's definitely something." He tapped the screen a few times, then held it toward her. It was a photograph, old, printed on actual photo paper. It showed a man and a woman, young, maybe late 20s. They were standing in front of the same motorcycle he'd been riding, but decades younger, the chrome catching the sun of a different era. The woman had her head tilted against the man's shoulder. They looked happy in that uncomplicated way that only people in old photographs seem to manage. "That's my parents," the biker said quietly. 1987, that's the Indian they bought together. That's the only bike my mother ever liked riding on. She died 3 years ago, car accident, not her fault. Just someone wasn't paying attention while reaching for their phone. Susan felt something shift in her chest, a small tremor in the bedrock of her certainty. "I'm very sorry, but..." "That's not the photograph I wanted to show you," he continued. He tapped again. A new image appeared. It was the same woman, older now, late 70s perhaps. Gray-haired, brilliant smile, arm around the man from the first photo. They were standing in front of the same bike. Taken last year, a month before she died. He lowered the phone. His eyes held hers, and Susan found herself unable to look away. "I ride that motorcycle because it's the only thing left that she loved," he said. "I park it in that space," he gestured toward the empty spot she'd stolen, "because it's the memorial I put in here. Plate says Mom. You probably didn't notice. People usually don't." Susan turned her head. The motorcycle's license plate read Mom 87 in white letters against a blue background. "Every Wednesday I come here, I sit in that coffee shop for 2 hours with people who knew her. We talk about her. And then I park the bike in that space and I wait until it's time to go home. That space is her space. Today was her birthday. She would have been 81. Susan's throat had gone dry. She wanted to say something, but the architecture of her certainty had begun to crumble, and she wasn't sure what was underneath it. "I didn't know," she said finally. "No," he agreed, "you didn't." He put his phone away and turned to walk back to his bike. "Wait," Susan said, "what's your name?" He paused, turned back. "Michael," he said, "Michael Caruso." "Susan Hartwell." He nodded as if filing the name away somewhere it would matter. "You need to move your car, Susan. You took my space, but more than that, you took something that wasn't yours to take. It's not about the parking. It's never about the parking." He walked back to the motorcycle and swung his leg over the seat with the casual grace of long practice. He put the helmet back on, but before he lowered the visor, she saw him close his eyes. The engine roared to life. For a moment, Susan thought he might say something else, but he just twisted the throttle, pulled out of the parking lot, and disappeared into the traffic with a roar that seemed to carry something indefinable. Not anger, but the weight of accumulated small betrayals. The understanding that the world was full of people taking spaces that didn't belong to them. Susan stood beside her Range Rover, still holding her purse, still dressed for her dinner, still the person she'd been 40 seconds ago. But something had shifted, some fundamental recalibration of what belonged to whom. The restaurant was perfect. Soft lighting, cloth napkins, a wine list that required a minor financial commitment to parse. Derek was on his third martini, gesturing animatedly about quarterly reports, and his boss, a carefully assembled man named Richard who seemed to have been designed by committee, was laughing at precisely the right moments. Susan ordered the salmon. She did not eat the salmon. Instead, she watched Michael Caruso's face in her mind. The scar. The careful way he'd shown her the photographs, like he was presenting evidence in a case he'd been building for years. The absolute clarity in his voice when he said, "It's not about the parking. It's never about the parking." "Susan, the wine." She blinked. Richard was holding out the wine list. "Oh, yes, thank you." She ordered a Sansera she wouldn't taste. Derek reached over and squeezed her hand. He was proud of her tonight, she realized. She was playing her role correctly, the successful woman who was nonetheless interested in men's work, attractive but not threateningly so, a reflection of his own achievement. She'd been playing this role for so long that she sometimes forgot there was anything underneath it. After dessert, Richard excused himself, and Derek leaned back in his chair with the satisfied expression of someone who'd successfully managed an impression. "That went well," he said. "Derek, can I ask you something?" "Of course." "When was the last time you did something for someone else? Something that wasn't for a reason, not for work or obligation or just because it mattered?" He looked confused. "What do you mean?" "I mean, have you ever helped someone and expected nothing in return?" Derek considered this with the serious expression he deployed for financial problems. "Well, I give to charity, the tennis club fundraiser I volunteer for." "That's not what I mean." He set down his wine glass with the delicate precision of someone placing a piece of evidence. "I'm not sure I understand what you're asking." Susan wasn't sure either. She thought about Michael Caruso, riding his dead mother's motorcycle to a parking lot every Wednesday. She thought about how much that must have hurt, and how he'd shown her anyway, not to shame her, but to make her understand what she'd taken. "Never mind," she said. "I'm just tired." They drove home in Derek's car, a Tesla that drove itself with terrifying certainty. Susan stared out the window at the New Jersey night, watching the world slide past in a parade of corporate signs and streetlights. Somewhere in this city, Michael Caruso was probably driving his motorcycle, the dead weight of the day settling around his shoulders like rain that wouldn't dry. She Googled him on her phone when she got home. Michael Caruso, New Jersey. The internet offered her 3 Michael Carusos, one who worked in insurance, one who had a criminal record, one who had died in 1994. None of them had a scar running from their temple to their jaw. None of them had a motorcycle with a license plate that said Mom 87. She tried Michael Caruso, Motorcycle, New Jersey. Nothing. Michael Caruso, Indian Chief. Nothing. She tried searching the news for motorcycle accidents, for deaths, for anything that might place him in a searchable context. Nothing. He existed in the real world, in the parking lot and the coffee shop and the motorcycle, but he had no digital presence. He was a ghost who'd briefly materialized in her Tuesday afternoon to deliver a message, and now he'd evaporated back into whatever layer of reality existed beneath the internet. Susan got ready for bed. Derek was already asleep, his breathing steady and intentional, the sleep of someone who'd never had an intrusive thought in his life. She lay beside him in the dark and thought about spaces, not the parking kind, but the ones inside you where you put away the things you didn't want to examine too closely. She'd been parking things there for years. Wednesday came like clockwork. Susan spent the morning trying not to think about the mall, which meant she thought about it constantly. By 2 p.m., she'd convinced herself to drive over, not to look for him, just to check, to verify that the space was still there, that none of this had been some kind of stress-induced hallucination. The parking lot looked exactly the way it always did, midweek quiet. The space where she'd parked, where Michael's mother's space was, sat empty, waiting. Susan pulled in but didn't park. She drove slowly through the lot, scanning for the motorcycle, for a face she couldn't quite forget. Nothing. The coffee shop was visible through the mall's glass walls, a handful of customers, no one who looked like they were mourning anything. She spent 40 minutes circling the lot, trying to look casual, trying to tell herself that she wasn't looking for him, not exactly. just thinking about parking strategy, just remembering she needed something from the mall. Just. The motorcycle appeared at 3:47 p.m. Michael pulled into the lot from the same direction he'd come 2 days ago, the bike moving with purposeful grace toward the memorial space. He dismounted with the same efficiency as before, removed his helmet, and stood for a moment looking at the empty spot as if it still contained something. Susan's heart was hammering. She put her car in park, not in the space, just in a nearby spot, and watched him. He sat down on a concrete planter near the motorcycle, his leather jacket dark against the bright afternoon. He didn't move for a long time, just sat there as if the concrete held the answer to something he'd been asking. After 20 minutes, a woman emerged from the mall. Older, maybe early 60s, with kind eyes and the particular gentleness of someone who'd learned to move carefully through the world. She sat down next to Michael without saying anything. They just sat there, two people on a concrete planter, not touching, not speaking, just present with each other. Susan felt something break inside her chest, some rigid thing that had been holding her together. They sat for another 40 minutes. Other people came and went, including what Susan realized must be the other Wednesday people. A man with gray hair, a woman about Michael's age, an elderly man who moved slowly but with dignity. They didn't sit all together, but in a kind of distributed grief, each person claiming their own spot around the motorcycle and the empty parking space. At exactly 5:15 p.m., Michael stood. He shook hands with the kind woman, he put his helmet back on, and he rode away, leaving the space empty again. Susan didn't move for a long time after he left. She sat in her car, the engine off, the air getting gradually warmer inside the vehicle. She thought about Derek at home, probably already working, sending emails with the kind of urgency that tomorrow could wait for nothing. She thought about the life she'd built, the acquisitions, the accomplishments, the perfect gradient of success that had never actually satisfied anything inside her. She thought about Michael Caruso, showing up to a parking lot once a week to sit with his grief. When she finally started the car, she drove not toward home but toward the coffee shop. She ordered a coffee she didn't particularly want and sat at a table by the window. She watched the empty parking space and the motorcycle, still there, even though Michael had left, as if it was rooted to that spot, and tried to understand what it meant to love something so much that you'd keep showing up for it, even after it was gone. A young employee, maybe 25, came over to check on her coffee. Susan looked up and asked, "Do you see someone come in here every Wednesday? Older man, leather jacket, rides a vintage motorcycle." The employee's face softened. "Oh, you mean Michael? Yeah, he comes in with his friends. They sit together and talk about Michael's mom. It's actually really sweet. She comes in here a lot too, I guess. That was their spot before she passed." Does he ever say anything about parking?" The employee looked confused. "Parking?" "Never mind," Susan said. "Thank you." She stayed in the coffee shop for another hour, nursing her coffee, waiting for the light to change the way it would change in this season, waiting for something inside her to shift back into place, or perhaps to finally fall away entirely so that something new could grow in its absence. Susan's life continued with the stubborn persistence of a routine that had calcified into identity. She woke at 6:30 a.m. She completed her morning exercise routine, 40 minutes on the Peloton while watching the news with the sound off. She showered, dressed, applied makeup with the precision of someone defusing a bomb. She made Derek his coffee and asked him about his day while he scrolled through his phone. But underneath this architecture of normalcy, something was changing. On Saturday, she drove to the mall alone, not to shop, just to sit in the parking lot and think, which was something she discovered she'd never actually done before. Usually, she drove with purpose, a destination already locked into her mind like a missile with a target. The parking lot was just the space between arriving and accomplishing, never the destination itself. Now she sat in her Range Rover and watched the space that was no longer just a space but had become, in her mind, a kind of shrine to absence. She thought about what Michael had said. It's never about the parking. He was right. The parking spot was just the geography. What it meant was deeper. It was about acknowledgement. It was about saying this person existed. This space is theirs. This matters. Derek would never understand that. Derek saw spaces, parking spaces, office spaces, spaces in the social hierarchy, as things to be conquered, optimized, monetized. The idea that you might hold a space sacred, keep it empty, honor what was missing, would strike him as a form of inefficiency. Susan realized, sitting in her car, that she'd married someone who saw the world the way she'd seen it before Michael Caruso showed up with photographs in his pocket. And that was perhaps the most devastating thing of all. Monday morning, she was in the coffee shop at 9 a.m., not the one in the mall, but a small independent place about 10 minutes from home called The Daily. She ordered a cappuccino and asked if she could use their Wi-Fi. She spent 3 hours researching grief support groups, motorcycle clubs, community organizations, anything that might give her a clue to how to find Michael Caruso and apologize, though she couldn't quite articulate what she'd be apologizing for. Stealing a parking space seemed too small. Taking his mother's memorial seemed too large. And apologizing for being someone who wouldn't have even noticed what she was taking before he showed her, that seemed somehow too honest. By 12:47 p.m., Susan had drunk 5 cappuccinos and made a decision that surprised her in its absoluteness. She went home and sat Derek down in the living room. It was unusual enough that he turned off his phone and gave her his full attention, which told her something about how far she'd already drifted from whatever role she was supposed to be playing. "I want to talk about our marriage," she said. Derek's face arranged itself into expressions of concern, the face of someone preparing to handle a crisis. "Is something wrong?" "I don't think I'm happy," Susan said. The words felt true the moment they left her mouth. "I think I've been managing the appearance of happiness for so long that I forgot to check if I actually felt it." "We can go to therapy," Derek said, which was his answer to most problems, the same way he'd suggest a software update to a malfunctioning computer. "I'll call that therapist who came recommended. We can." "I don't think therapy fixes what's broken," Susan said. "I think what's broken is that I became someone I don't recognize, and I don't know how to become myself again." Derek was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Is there someone else?" It was such a reasonable assumption that Susan almost laughed. "Not in the way you mean." But even as she said it, she knew it was a lie. There was someone else, not a man she was in love with, but an image, a moment, a man with a scar showing her photographs of his dead mother. There was the profound elsewhere of Michael Caruso's grief, and she was reaching toward it like a plant toward the sun. "I think we should separate," Susan said. "Not divorce, just separate. I need to figure out who I am when I'm not performing being me." Derek took this with the same expression he'd wear if she'd suggested they refinance the house. He treated it as a problem to be managed. "We have social obligations," he said. "The Hendersons' party is next month. If we separate, people will talk. My position at the firm." "I know," Susan said. "I'll be discreet." She found an apartment that week. A one-bedroom in a neighborhood that Derek would have found too bohemian, too close to the commercial district, too lacking in property values. She furnished it minimally with thrift store finds and the kind of pieces that didn't matter if they got damaged or worn. She hung no photographs. She made no effort to make it a home. It was a space to think in, nothing more. She told Derek they would tell friends she was taking time for herself, personal growth, a sabbatical from the marriage. None of this was technically untrue. On Wednesday, she went back to the mall. She arrived at 3:45 p.m. and positioned her car, a rental Honda, deliberately unostentatious, where she could watch the memorial space without sitting directly in it. The coffee shop was visible from this angle, and she could see the kind woman and the man with gray hair already inside. Michael arrived at 3:52 p.m. He rode the same motorcycle, wore the same jacket, moved with the same careful precision. He parked the bike and simply stood there for a moment, as if gathering something before he could begin. That's when Susan saw someone she recognized. It was Richard, Derek's boss. He emerged from the mall carrying shopping bags from an expensive boutique, but he wasn't headed toward the parking garage. He was walking directly toward Michael. Michael turned as Richard approached. For a moment, Susan thought they were about to speak. Instead, Richard placed his hand on Michael's shoulder. They stood together for a moment, silent, while Richard's shopping bags swung at his side. Then Richard said something. Susan couldn't hear it from her car, but she could see his lips moving. Michael responded, and his face did something Susan had never seen it do. It smiled. Actually smiled, a real smile that changed the whole architecture of his face. Richard went inside the coffee shop. Susan watched this transaction with an increasing sense of unreality. How did Richard know Michael? How did Michael know the boss of the man she was leaving? She made a decision that surprised her. She got out of the car. Her feet carried her across the parking lot in a walk that felt both too fast and impossibly slow. Michael was putting on his helmet, preparing to leave, but he must have sensed the movement in his peripheral vision because he paused. He turned, and even with the helmet partially on, she could see the recognition. His body language shifted, not hostile exactly, but guarded. "Hello," Susan said. "Hello," Michael replied, and his voice was the same careful precision as before. "I don't know how to apologize for taking your space," Susan said, "so I'm not going to try to do that, but I want you to know that what you showed me, it changed something." Michael removed his helmet. "Changed what?" "I'm not sure yet," Susan said, "but I left my husband, not because of you, but because I realized I'd been parking myself in the wrong space my whole life, and I never would have noticed if you hadn't shown me what it meant." Michael was very still for a moment. Then he said, "Richard told me about you. He said Derek had a wife who seemed very happy but clearly wasn't. He said if I ever felt charitable, I could try to explain that sometimes the places we think we belong don't belong to us." Susan felt the ground shift beneath her. You knew about me." "Not before Wednesday, but yes, after." "Why didn't you say anything?" "Because some things have to be figured out alone," Michael said. "My grief, my mom, that's not a lesson for you to learn, that's my thing. You had to find your own reason." They stood together in the parking lot, with the motorcycle between them and the memorial space stretching empty behind them. "Can I ask you something?" Susan said. "Do you always park in this space, or did you know I'd try to take it?" Michael actually laughed. "I've been parking in this space every Wednesday at 3:50 p.m. for 3 years. I had no idea you existed. The universe arranged things without consulting me." "So it's coincidence?" "Maybe it's just the way things are," Michael said. "When you're open to destruction, you can meet people who have already been destroyed. When you start paying attention to emptiness, you notice other people guarding their empties." The afternoon light was changing, turning golden at the edges. Behind them, the coffee shop seemed to glow like a warm pocket of the world. "Are you going to join your friends?" Susan asked. "Yeah," Michael said. "Richard's in there, he comes by sometimes, he knew my mom." "Through work?" "Through life," Michael said. "He was married to her once, a long time ago." Susan processed this information. Derek's boss, Michael's mother's ex-husband, sitting in the coffee shop, holding Wednesday together with the quiet persistence of people who understood that nothing is ever finally over. "I think I should go," Michael said. "But I'm glad you came back. I think you're going to be okay." "How do you know?" "Because you're already asking the right questions," he said. "You just have to keep asking them until you run out." He put his helmet back on and climbed onto the motorcycle. Susan stepped back from the parking space, and Michael rode away, leaving only the sound of the engine and the faint smell of exhaust. She stood there for a long moment, watching the empty space that his bike had occupied. Then she turned and walked into the coffee shop. Richard looked up from his table and smiled. A real smile, not the careful expressions he deployed in Derek's presence. Next to him sat the kind woman and the man with gray hair. They were looking at photographs on a phone, laughing at something. The coffee shop became Susan's space in a way the Range Rover never had been. Every Wednesday at 4 p.m., she sat at a table by the window with Richard, Michael, and 2 other members of what they'd started calling the Wednesday Circle. There was Helen, the kind woman who had been Michael's mother's best friend for 40 years. There was Robert, a retired teacher who dated Michael's mother briefly in the 1990s. And there was Patricia, who ran a nonprofit and had simply started coming after the first time she'd run into Michael in the parking lot, and he'd told her what he was doing there. They didn't talk about grief exactly, or rather, they talked about it the way people talk about weather, as something constant that everyone acknowledged without needing to explain. But underneath that surface conversation, there were stories. Michael's mother had been a sculptor. She taught both Patricia and Helen to make things. Robert had a collection of her work in his living room. Richard had kept every letter she'd written him after their divorce. Susan found herself listening to these stories with a hunger she'd never experienced before. It was as if she'd been starving and only now recognized food when it appeared. 4 weeks into her separation, Susan brought her own story. "I've been married for 16 years, she said to the table. No preamble, they didn't do preamble. "And I don't think I ever chose it. I think I chose the idea of being married. I chose the thing marriage represented: stability, success, completion. But I never chose the person. If I'm honest, I don't think I even looked at Derek. I just saw the role he fit and asked him to fill it. Do you love him? Helen asked. Susan considered this. I think I care about him the way you care about an old apartment. I have memories in him, but I'm not sure I ever saw him, and I'm not sure he ever saw me. Michael was watching her with an expression that suggested he already knew this answer. My mom did that for about 3 years, Michael said. She married because it was what you did. Then one day she realized that the thing she'd been calling love was just relief that the decision had been made for her. It took her another year to figure out how to unmake it. How? Susan asked. She just did, Michael said. She told him the truth. He was devastated, then he got over it. Now they're friends sometimes. It's odd, but not bad. Patricia nodded. The hard part isn't the leaving, it's the realizing that you've wasted time. That's the part that kills you. I'm not sure I've wasted time, Susan said. I think I just lived in the wrong frame, like I was looking at a painting through glass and thought that was all there was to it. She paused, then added, I think I needed to hit something to have the glass break, and that thing was a parking space, which is almost funny. Richard smiled. My wife left me for someone she actually saw, he said. It was painful, but she did it cleanly and honestly, and I respected her for it. We're still friends. What's not okay is staying when you know you don't belong. That's lying, and everyone knows it. The conversation drifted to other things. Patricia talked about a grant she was writing. Helen mentioned a sculpture of Michael's mother's that had been donated to a museum. Michael laughed about a terrible first motorcycle he'd owned that had broken down consistently. But Susan was listening to something underneath, the permission being given. Not permission to hurt Derek, but permission to be honest about the hurt. That Friday, Susan called Derek and asked if they could talk in person. He suggested lunch, a nice restaurant, neutral territory, as if they were negotiating a business deal. She agreed, then changed the location to a coffee shop that had no pretension, no wine list, no anything except coffee and honesty. Derek arrived wearing his armor of expectation. He thought she wanted to negotiate. He thought this was logistics, division of assets, custody arrangements for the house. Susan sat across from him and said, I need to tell you something I should have said 16 years ago. I never loved you. I chose you because you fit a category of what I thought I needed, and I've been performing being happy with you ever since. And I'm sorry I wasted your time. Derek's face went through several expressions in rapid succession. That's not fair, he finally said. That's not Susan. We have history. We have a life. We have a mortgage, Susan said. We have social obligations. We have sex 3 times a month on Sundays, but we don't have anything real. I don't accept that, Derek said, which was perhaps the most Derek thing he could have said. It's not something that requires your acceptance, Susan said. It's just true. He tried to argue, to negotiate, to problem-solve his way out of being left by someone who'd never actually been present. It was painful to watch, and Susan felt the weight of it. The knowledge that she'd let him build an entire identity around someone who'd never actually existed. But she didn't take it back. She didn't try to smooth it over or soften it. She just told the truth over and over until the truth was so undeniable that Derek had to accept it, the way you eventually accept that winter is not a temporary condition. By the time they left the coffee shop, it was decided, divorce, clean and careful, Derek would keep the house. Susan would take some money and the freedom to figure out who she was. There would be lawyers and paperwork and all the necessary procedures of dissolution. But underneath it all was a single clear fact. Susan had stopped performing. That Wednesday, when she arrived at the coffee shop, she looked different. Michael noticed immediately. You did it, he said. I did it, Susan confirmed. Okay, Helen said, and Patricia smiled, and Robert nodded the way people nod when something difficult has finally been completed correctly. They sat together as the afternoon light changed, and for the first time, Susan understood what Michael had been doing all these weeks, not mourning exactly, but acknowledging. Keeping a space empty not out of sadness, but out of love. Making sure that every Wednesday, his mother was remembered as a person rather than absorbed into the general haze of the forgotten. After the coffee shop closed, Michael and Susan walked to the parking lot together. The memorial space sat empty, the way it always did. The motorcycle would be back next Wednesday. Can I tell you something? Michael said. Of course. I was afraid that bringing my grief to you, showing you the photographs, I was afraid I'd just made you sad. I thought maybe you'd go back to your husband and just be sadder and trapped. That would have been bad. But I didn't, Susan said. But you didn't, Michael agreed. You used my destruction to find your own truth, which is the only good thing that destruction can be used for, I think. They stood by the motorcycle, and the parking lot hummed with the evening traffic beginning to build around them. I want to ask you something, Susan said, and you can say no and it won't change anything. Okay. Can I buy you dinner sometime? Not here, not part of the Wednesday thing, just... Michael kissed her before she could finish the sentence. It was a careful kiss, gentle, the kind of kiss someone gives when they understand that you're fragile and have been for a long time, but you're finally becoming unbroken. 6 months passed. The seasons changed, and with them came the slow accumulation of moments that make a life. Susan and Michael moved slowly at first, dinners in places with careful lighting, walks through neighborhoods neither of them had explored, the careful process of learning each other without the framework of roles or performance. She learned that he was a carpenter, that he built custom furniture in a workshop behind his house, that he'd studied architecture in college but found he preferred working with his hands. He learned that she had wanted to be a writer, that she'd abandoned it when it seemed impractical, that she'd been trying to write again now that she had space to fail. Derek signed the divorce papers in April. There was no conflict, no drama, just the quiet acceptance that sometimes things end not with betrayal but with honesty. He was dating someone new by June, and Susan found she didn't feel anything about it except a distant relief that he'd found someone, and a hope that perhaps this person actually saw him, actually chose him rather than the category he fit. Michael's mother would have been 82 on a Wednesday in July. The Wednesday circle grew that week. Helen brought a woman who'd been in their mother's sculpting class. Patricia invited her partner. Robert brought his grandson. They sat in the coffee shop and looked at more photographs, and Michael talked about the time his mother had tried to learn to ride a motorcycle at 75 and crashed into a fence on the first day. She got right back on it, Michael said. She said, I didn't expect to be good at it, I expected to try. After the coffee shop, they all went to the parking lot. Michael took out a sculpture from a bag, small, abstract, a piece his mother had made decades ago. He placed it on the concrete planter beside the memorial space. I'm expanding the memorial, he said. Instead of just holding the space for her, I'm going to fill it with the things she made. Every Wednesday, there'll be something new. People can contribute, or I'll just rotate pieces through. That's beautiful, Susan said. It's evolution, Michael said. Grief evolves, or it should. You can't hold on to absence forever. Eventually, you have to let it become something else. Susan was working on a novel now. It was about a woman who spent her entire life in someone else's space, who woke up one day and realized she'd never actually lived. It was painful to write, but it was becoming true in a way her life never had been. The protagonist wasn't Susan exactly, but she wasn't not Susan either. She was everyone who'd ever woken up in the wrong parking space and had to figure out how to move. In August, Derek invited Michael and Susan to dinner. It was awkward in the way things are when the past has been definitively ended but still casts a shadow. Derek had tried to make it a casual thing, but the formality underneath was visible. He wanted to understand what he'd missed. He wanted to see what this man had that he didn't. Michael was kind about it. He asked Derek about his work, actually listened, the way Michael listened to everything. And by the end of the dinner, Derek seemed less confused about what he'd lost and more clear about what he'd never actually had. She never looked at me the way she looks at you, Derek said as they were leaving. She wasn't looking at anyone, Michael replied. She was looking at herself. I just happened to be present when she did. By September, Michael had asked Susan to move in. She did, into his house with the workshop and the walls covered in the things he'd built. She set up a writing desk in the spare room. She brought her books, the ones she'd kept from college, the ones that still smelled like who she'd been before she became who everyone else wanted her to be. On the last Wednesday of September, they went to the memorial space as they had every Wednesday for the past 8 months. The sculpture had expanded. There was Michael's mother's work, but also Helen's. Patricia had contributed a photograph her nonprofit had taken of a community project. Robert had brought a poem he'd written. The parking space was no longer empty. It was becoming something, a repository of love, a physical manifestation of the people who gathered to remember that one person mattered. I'm pregnant, Susan said. She hadn't planned to tell him in the parking lot, it had just come out. Michael turned to her, his expression shifting from contemplation to something more complex. "What?" he said. "Surprise," Susan said. "I found out this morning. I was going to do something elaborate, but I thought you should know here. I thought she should be part of this somehow." Michael looked at the memorial space, at his mother's sculpture, at the accumulation of love that had been transformed into something beautiful and public. "She would have liked that," he said. "She would have said something about new spaces and old spaces and how they're never really separate." He pulled Susan close, and they stood there in the parking lot as the sun was setting, as the shadows were lengthening, as another Wednesday came to a close. A young woman walked past them on her way to the mall. She was pushing a stroller, tired, hurried. She didn't notice the memorial. She didn't stop. She just kept walking toward whatever she needed to accomplish. Michael squeezed Susan's hand. Maybe that woman would someday have her own parking space story. Maybe she'd someday understand that the places we belong aren't the places we've always inhabited. Maybe someday the universe would arrange a collision between her and her own destruction and her own truth. Or maybe not. Maybe some people would spend their whole lives in the wrong space and never realize it. Maybe that was okay, too. "Come on," Michael said. "We should go tell Helen." They walked back toward the coffee shop, toward the space where the Wednesday circle waited, toward the accumulation of small moments that had somehow become a life. And the memorial space remained empty behind them, but not empty in the way it had been. It was full now, full of absence transformed into presence, full of the understanding that sometimes the most important things we can do is honor the space where something loved used to be. The space would be there next Wednesday, and the Wednesday after that. The motorcycle would return, the sculpture would evolve, and people would continue to show up, continuing to remember that some things, some people, were worth holding sacred. And Susan, walking toward her future, understood finally what Michael had been trying to tell her that first afternoon. It was never about the parking space. It was about the willingness to see that you'd been in the wrong place and the courage to move. The parking space at Riverside Shopping Mall had become legendary in its own small way. There was a feature in the local paper, the Wednesday Circle, a community's growing memorial. Michael had been interviewed, and he'd explained it simply. Someone I loved was gone, so I held a space for her, and then other people brought their loves, their memories, their things. It became a place where absence could be beautiful. There was a formal small ceremony when they decided to make the memorial permanent. The mall management had agreed to designate the space and install a small plaque. It read, "Mom 87, a space held in love." The memorial had expanded far beyond sculpture. It included photographs, letters, objects, art. There was a sculpture by Michael's mother, jewelry made by someone Robert had known, watercolors Helen had painted, a poem Patricia had written. Every Wednesday, people came and added to it, sometimes new contributors, sometimes the same faithful few who had been coming for years. Michael and Susan's daughter was born in the spring and named Margaret after Michael's mother. She was now 2 years old, and she came to the Wednesday Circle in her stroller, babbling at Helen and laughing at Robert's terrible jokes. She didn't understand yet that this place held grief, but she understood that it held love. Susan's novel had been published to modest success. It wasn't a bestseller, but it was read, and it had found an audience of people who recognized themselves in the protagonist's journey from performing to being. The book had a dedication, "For Michael and for the parking space that broke me open." Derek had married again to a woman named Catherine who actually saw him and seemed to like what she saw. He'd sent a wedding invitation, and Michael and Susan had sent a gift, a custom-built side table crafted by Michael's hands. On this particular Wednesday, something new happened. A woman pulled into the mall parking lot in a pristine white Range Rover. She looked to be in her mid-50s, carefully put together, the kind of person Susan had been. The woman began to park in a space, then noticed something. A motorcycle, vintage Indian Chief, a license plate that read, Mom 87. The woman paused. She looked at the empty memorial space. She looked at the sculpture, the photographs, the accumulated weight of love made physical. Michael was inside the coffee shop and he didn't see her, but Patricia did. Patricia got up and walked outside. "Can I help you?" Patricia asked. The woman was staring at the motorcycle. "What is this place?" she asked. "It's a memorial," Patricia said. "Do you want to know the story?" The woman turned away from the parking space. "I'm actually just looking for a spot," she said. I need to get into the mall. Patricia smiled. There are plenty of spaces in the back lot, she said. That one's reserved. The woman nodded and drove away. She parked in a different space and went into the mall, and she would never know what she'd almost taken, and that was perhaps the way these things were supposed to work. You had to be broken first. You had to have your glass shattered before you could see clearly. Some people would never break. Some people would stay their whole lives in the wrong spaces, and that was okay too. But some people would see something. A motorcycle, a memorial, a face that looked like it carried important information, and they would start to wonder. And that wondering would lead to other wonderings, and eventually, if they were lucky, they would end up sitting in a coffee shop with strangers who became family, holding a space for the things and people they'd lost, and learning that loss transformed is love. Michael emerged from the coffee shop as Patricia was coming back in. He saw the empty space where the Range Rover had been. "Someone came?" he asked. "Someone came," Patricia confirmed, "but she wasn't ready yet." Michael nodded. He understood. Readiness couldn't be forced. It came when it came, usually accompanied by a kind of beautiful destruction. He walked out to the memorial space and looked at it the way he did every Wednesday, not with sadness, but with the clarity that comes when you understand that emptiness, held with intention, becomes sacred. His daughter Margaret toddled out of the coffee shop, held by Susan's hand. She pointed at the motorcycle and made a sound of delight, the universal baby sound of recognition and joy. "That's Grandma's bike," Michael said to her. "Someday you'll ride on it." Margaret had no idea what he was talking about. She just knew that the world was full of interesting things, and that her father loved her, and that on Wednesdays there was coffee and people and stories that made the adults smile. It was enough. It was, in fact, everything. The parking space remained, as it always did. Empty, full, sacred, ordinary. A space held in love, a space that taught people that sometimes you have to lose everything to find yourself. Sometimes you have to break to understand what's real. Sometimes the most important things we do are the spaces we hold for those we love and those we're still trying to become. The sun began to set over Riverside Shopping Mall. Somewhere in the building, a woman in a white Range Rover was trying on clothes she didn't need, making space in her life for things that didn't matter. Eventually, maybe, she would wake up. Eventually, maybe, she would realize that the spaces she'd been defending weren't the spaces she actually belonged in. Or maybe she wouldn't. Maybe she would spend her whole life in someone else's parking space, never understanding what it meant to move. But the space would be there, waiting. The memorial would continue to grow. And on every Wednesday, for as long as they could, the people who understood what it meant to hold sacred ground would come together in a parking lot and remember that love is the only thing that matters, and that the most beautiful spaces are sometimes the ones we save for the ones we've lost.